Hello there, my name is Elliot Dorff. I'm happy to have you with me today to talk about some pieces of my new book, Ethics at the Center, Jewish Theory and Practice for Living a Jewish Life. And today, as the description of this session indicated, I'm going to be talking about some very abstract things first, which I will make much more concrete. And then we're going to be talking about the ethics of war as the example that I'm going to be talking about today. One of the convictions I have is that uh, concrete moral decisions depend upon much larger issues, namely, how do you understand the nature of human beings? How do you understand the nature of the environment and of the transcendent element of human experience? So in the first three chapters of this book, I talk about that. I talk about what does it mean to believe in God in the first place. That's chapter one. And what does it mean not to believe in God? And then also, so then second, what are some of the Jewish understandings of God? And then the third, what are the Jewish understandings of the human being? So I'm going to be talking about that first, and then I'm going to jump to the chapter on war. um, we human beings. Oh, I moved so that. Hold on. There we go. There I am again. We human beings experience life on three different levels. The first level is the concrete level: tables, chairs, human beings, environment, trees, things like that. And that's the first level of experience. And even on that level, it's difficult to get very clear definitions of what we know. So the example I give in the book is, what is a table? You might think it's a flat surface with legs, but then of course a flat surface with legs is also a chair. And there are some tables like those in restaurant booths that are screwed into the wall rather than having legs. And if you say that, well, it's a flat surface to put things on, well, that's also a floor and a desk. And so even something as simple as a table is something really hard to define, let alone another thing that we get in our concrete experience, let's say a song. How do you distinguish a song from noise? Given the fact that people disagree a lot about what they can think is good music and what's not. In addition to that, there's atonal music that was created by Arnold Schoenberg, a Jewish fellow, a long time, about 100 years ago. And so that makes it even harder to decide what a song is. So that's even on the concrete level. Then there's the second level of human experience, which are where we see examples of it, but we don't see the thing itself. And that includes things like family, community, beauty, truth, justice. These are all things that are really important in our lives. And we see examples of them, but we never see the things themselves. That's what I call the first level of abstraction. But then there is, if it was hard to define tables and songs, all the more so is it hard to define things like justice and beauty and truth. And I have a doctorate in philosophy. Let me just tell you that philosophers have wrestled with that from the time of Plato to our own time. Plato's Republic was a discussion about what justice means, and you still get that in the 20th and now the 21st century among philosophers as to what does justice mean, let alone what is just in a particular circumstance. And the same sorts of things about truth. You have a correspondence theory of truth and a coherence theory of truth among philosophers, and beauty. Yes, again, people disagree a lot about what's beautiful and what's not. And so, is there any kind of definition of what beauty means? So that's the first level of abstraction, which almost all of us have at least understand as being really important, but we'll have even more difficulty describing in detail. And then there is a second level of abstraction, which is the container of it all, the container of all of that, of our experience, both our concrete experience and our experience on the first level of abstraction. Philosophers call that metaphysics, that which is above the physical world, meta being above. And philosophers are interested in describing and analyzing everything that philosophers deal with. That's the goal, to try to describe it, analyze it, compare it to other things. Religions, the very word religion, the Lig in the word religion, comes from the Latin ligare, meaning to connect or to bond. So religions really have a very different purpose than philosophies do. Religions have the purpose of connecting us to each other as families and communities, to the environment, and to the transcendent element of human experience, which again, philosophers call metaphysics, and in religion that's called the transcendent or God. And we give a name to it. And we, as a matter of fact, give multiple names to it in the Jewish tradition. And so that, because it can't be described, but we describe God in multiple ways in the Torah itself, let alone in the Siddur and in later Jewish literature. So God is what we just went through the high holidays, our Father, our King. God is Sur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel. God is, the Lord is my shepherd. God is our shepherd. God is water. God is a cistern, is a well, is a river. God has all these kinds of metaphors, and the reason why we use these metaphors is because, on the one hand, the experience is real. We're not inventing the experience. We have the experience of the transcendent in our lives. But we are not able to define it in any succinct way. And so what we try to do is use metaphors to explain what it is in our understanding of the transcendent that we are experiencing. And what it means to believe in, not to believe in God, is either not to have that experience altogether, or more commonly to have had a particular image of God. God is that, Michelangelo, God is the man on the mountain with the flowing white beard, and you've never seen that, and it never really made much sense to you. God is that which will give you everything you desire if you pray hard enough. And then it turns out that you ask for something, and it could be really serious, the health of somebody, and the person didn't recover. And then so you don't believe in God anymore because you prayed and you didn't get what you wanted. That's a common reason why people no longer believe in God. Or God is supposed to be just, and God didn't prevent the Holocaust, or didn't prevent what's going on today in today's wars in Israel and Ukraine. So how could there be a God who's just and who allows this to happen? People don't believe in God because they had a particular image of God, and that did not pan out. And for some, it's there is an experience of the transcendent, but it doesn't matter very much in their lives. And so they might say, I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic, or yeah, I believe in God, but it doesn't really make much difference in my life. On the other hand, for people who hold a strong God belief, it does make a difference in their lives, and they're interested in making it part of what enriches their lives, because it gives their lives a perspective, a context that it would not have had otherwise. One of the best ways in which the rabbis capture this is by calling God hamakom, the place. It is the context, the place of everything else in our experience. A lovely way that one of the ways that I love comes from an African American, used to be called the Negro spiritual. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. He's got you and me, brother. In his hands, he's got you and me, sister. In his hands, he's got the little bitty baby. In his hands, the point of it being that it's the ultimate context of human experience. The way that Hebrew describes that is kadosh. God is Holy, which means holy, Wholly, other, wholly different, wholly other than anything that we can capture completely in our experience. That's the sense of God's holiness. God is completely different from what we are able to comprehend, let alone experience directly. So, whereas those people who believe in God, for them, and I'll say for me, it is that kind of perspective is really important in terms of how I think about my life and how I live it. Because it gives me a sense of the reality that I'm not living only on a concrete level, or even just on the first level of abstraction, I'm living in this broad context of things as well. And in order to make us connect to God, Judaism, among other religions, will create these metaphors that help us do that. And we are probably most likely to be able to create relationships with other human beings. We can create relationships with God and with animals and so on, but most of the metaphors for God are human metaphors. And as long as you understand that they are metaphors and not intended to be complete descriptions of God, you're fine. You're not creating an idol out of a particular metaphor. The metaphors for God that have to do with war, we're going to talk about in just a little while. Let me talk about the human being now. You might think that human beings are sort of obvious, but I need to tell you that various cultural convictions and various religious perspectives on the nature of the human being vary radically. So I'm just going to take three that you may know of. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's, of course, the American Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson cribbed that from John Locke, a British philosopher who had written it about a century earlier, although Locke had said life, liberty, and property. And you can imagine how many doctoral dissertations have been written about why did Jefferson change it from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in any case, as an American, I'm an individual with rights. And other people have rights as well. So the next line in the Declaration of Independence, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So you have governments in order to try to determine how my rights are limited by virtue of your rights. But the burden of proof, if you start out with this perception, then each of us is an individual, and each of us is a person with rights. Now, if you take the Jewish tradition, the central story in the Jewish tradition is Exodus Sinai. We leave Egypt not as individuals, we leave as a community. And when we get to Sinai, we don't get a single right. We get 613 commandments according to the traditional count. Now, I do a lot of interfaith work, and sometimes I say to Christian audiences, this is the beginning of Jewish guilt, right? Because we have 613 commandments. The Catholics tell me that we Jews know nothing about guilt, that they have that market cornered. And I laugh about that. But the fact of the matter is that we start out in the Jewish tradition as a member of a community, not as an individual, as a member of a community with duties. Now, duties and rights sometimes are reciprocal. So I have a right to my sweater, and that means that you have a duty not to steal it. But duties and rights are not always reciprocal. My duties to my parents, Aleichem Shalom, were different from my duties to my children. My duties to my country are different from my country's duties to me. And in any case, if I get up in the morning and I'm an individual with rights, then the world owes me. But if I get up in the morning and I am a member of a community with duties, then I owe the world. And that's a wholly different way of understanding who I am. I'm not just an individual, I'm a member of a community, and I don't start out with rights, I start out with duties, with commitments, with commandments, actually. So the understanding of who I am as a Jew is really rather different from who I am as an American. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. There are some places in some ways in which the Jewish understanding of who I am and the American understanding of who I am are one and the same. So, for example, both of those ways of looking at us would say that the individual is really important, but for different reasons. In the American understanding, each individual is a reservoir of rights, and therefore has to be respected as such. In the Jewish tradition, the reason why I need to be respected is because I'm created in the image of God, as is every other human being. Exactly what that means is debated a lot in the Jewish tradition. Not surprisingly, I would imagine, right? Because the classical joke is two Jews, three opinions. Although I mentioned that one time at a scholar in residence weekend, and a man came up to me and said, "Do you really need two Jews for three opinions?" But in any case, certainly for something as 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 fundamental in our tradition as the idea that each of us is created in the image of God, you can imagine that Jews would disagree as to exactly what that means. Um, I think that the immediate meaning of it, remember that idea that each of us is creating the image of God appears three times in the early chapters of Genesis, in chapter 1, chapter 5, and chapter 9. So the Torah really wanted us to take this idea very seriously. And I think in chapter 3, we get a sense of what the Torah meant by it. That's the Garden of Eden story. And you remember Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, not scientific knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. And they get kicked out of the garden for fear that if they eat of the fruit of the tree of life and live eternally, they will be as gods. So presumably, a divine feature of human beings is that we are able to distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad, and act on that ability. In other words, we have free will. That's the image of God in us. Um, Others in the tradition, like Maimonides, thinks that the image of God within us is that we are able to think discursively, that we're able to follow a logical argument. Others think that there's a spiritual part to us as well as a physical part to us, and the spiritual part to us is what is the image of God within us. But the image of God within us doesn't mean that you have to like everybody, let alone condone what everybody does. And as a matter of fact, the Torah in Deuteronomy 21 says that when somebody has been convicted of a capital crime and is hanged, you have to take the person down from the gallows by nightfall, because a person hanging on the gallows, kilulat Elohimi, it's a curse of God, because even though the person did something terrible, so terrible as to warrant the death penalty, nevertheless that person is created in the image of God and therefore has to be respected as such. Again, that doesn't mean that you have to like everybody or that you have to respect or condone what they do, but it does mean that there's an inherent respect that the Jewish tradition affirms for each of us. Again, for very different reasons than the American tradition, or the American. It's really Western Enlightenment, as opposed to the Jewish tradition. And then another way in which the American tradition and the Jewish traditions overlap are that both of them believe that law is binding, even on the head of the community. So even a president is subject to the law. I hope that continues to be the case in American law. And in the Jewish tradition, Deuteronomy chapter 17, the king has to write a copy of the Torah and have it with him at all times, because he has to recognize that even the king is subject to the law. So those are two ways that the individual has inherent worth, although for different reasons, and that law binds us all, that make the American tradition and the Jewish tradition at one. But there are a lot of ways in which the American part of me, of which I'm very proud, by the way, America is by far the most pluralistic country that has ever existed on the face of the earth. I do a lot of interfaith work, and one of my priest friends told me that in the Los Angeles Archdiocese, the Mass is given in 80 different languages, not just English and Spanish, 80 different languages. And that doesn't mean that we all get along together, but far better than what's going on in a lot of other countries where there's a minority or several minorities that are persecuted, or that the majority is having a lot of trouble with. I mean, look what's happening in Europe, for example, with its Muslim minority, its new Muslim minority, or what happens to minorities in Arab countries, which basically is very difficult for those minorities. So in America, I mean, certainly there was slavery, and we're still living with some of the implications of that. There was anti-Semitism. There was, a time not just 100 years ago when women did not have the right to vote, and women's rights have increased over time. So I mean, America is not a perfect society. No human society is, but the pluralism of America, which is something that is that has been aspirational from we hold these truths to be self-evident. That aspiration, I think, is really remarkable among human societies. And so I'm really proud to be an American. But it is the case that there have been a number of bumps along the way, and there are still a number of bumps in our own day. And the same is true in the Jewish tradition, even though I'm deeply committed to it and deeply appreciative of many, many, many things that are in the Jewish tradition. It is the case that there have been a number of bumps along the way, many of which have been smoothed out by rabbis and lay leaders over the centuries, and some of them even our own time. If you were Christian, then Christianity, you are born with original sin. That is, you have sins in your very origin, in your DNA, as it were, and you cannot overcome them on your own. There's no salvation by works, Paul says in the New Testament. And so consequently, you have to believe in a supernatural intercessor, Jesus, in order to redeem you from your sins. That raises real questions about things like free will and responsibility. What I very often say the Christian audiences is that Judaism, because we believe in free will, and we have the ability to not only know right from wrong, but also to act on that knowledge, Judaism spells responsibility with a capital R. That's a large part of the Jewish guilt stuff, right? But it also means that I am a member of a community that I really need to that I really need to serve and to help flourish. Now I want to get now to how all of this applies to war. First of all, as the chapter that it's chapter 16 in this book. Chapter 16 talks about the fact that the images of the human being and the images of God are not completely passive. Kohelet, for example, says there is a time for war and there is a time for peace. The Torah has rules about war in Deuteronomy 20:21. The first prophets, that former prophets, Joshua, well, the Torah itself, but also Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, describes a multitude of wars that Jews were engaged in. So it's not as if Jews were completely pacifists. And even God in the tradition, let me get you the exact number. I looked it up in the concordance just for the fun of it. And in the Bible, here we have it. Many Jews do not like to confront this fact, but God is depicted in the Bible as a God of war. A check of the biblical concordance indicates that the phrase Adonai Tzvaot, Lord of Armies, appears 244 times in the Hebrew Bible, and together with similar phrases such as Adonai Elohei Tzvaot, the Lord God of Armies, the depiction of God as a God of war appears 286 times in the Hebrew Bible. Now, God also is understood as a God of peace. So the Lord said to Gideon, this is Judges chapter 6, verses 23, 24, you will have peace, have no fear, you shall not die. So Gideon built there an altar to the Lord and called it Adonai Shalom, the Lord of peace. And based on that verse, the rabbis say, great is peace, for all blessings are contained in it. Greatest peace, for God's name is peace. In other words, the first part, if you don't have peace, then all kinds of other blessings like health and knowledge and community and family, all of those are very much at risk. So peace is really important. And as a result, the end of every service, that we have, ask God for peace. Oseh shalom bimromav v'yaseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, right? I mean, that kind of thing. And sim shalom is the end of the Amidah in the morning, shalom rav in the afternoon and evening. So there is a very strong sense that peace is a goal of ours. And the Jewish tradition did not see war as the ultimate way to show that a man is a man, to prove masculinity. It very much appreciates those of us who have had to fight and do fight and keep us safe. So hence you get the Maccabees during the Maccabean period. And now in modern Israel, the Israel Defense Forces, Tzahal, are very much appreciated because they keep, they're the ones that, to the extent that it's possible, keep Israelis safe. So people who are involved in doing that, and by the way, that also included Jews who served in, let's say, the American army or in the army of their nation, whatever it was. Um, because one of the things that comes out of the Jewish tradition is that while war is certainly not the ideal, it is something that sometimes is necessary and must be done. And that's done not only on the communal level, but also on the individual level. The rabbis say, "Abal lahargacha, hashkem lahargo." One who comes to kill you, kill him first, right? So in other words, the requirement of self-defense is a requirement in Jewish law. It's not turn the other cheek by any means. It is that you need to defend yourself, and you need to, as a community, to find ways to defend yourself as well. Now that said, again, this is not the ideal option. The ideal option is to find ways to make peace with other nations. And there's a lot in those chapters of Deuteronomy 20:21 that talk about trying to make peace first. And in the stories in former prophets, in the books that I mentioned, you get at least attempts to try to make peace before going to war. And that is, I think, really important. Um, really important to say before I talk about Jewish laws having to do with war. Now, it was only in the First Temple period, which means roughly from, well, let's say even before that, from the time of Moses to the time of the destruction of the First Temple. So let's say 1250 before the Common Era to 586 before the Common Era, where Jews decided what wars to engage in and how to engage in them. And then the next time that Jews were in charge of that was during the Maccabean period, roughly from 165 before the Common Era, the Hanukkah story, until 63 before the Common Era, when the Romans marched into Jerusalem. So roughly that 100 years. And then again, not until the modern state of Israel in 1948. So it's really only in those three periods that Jews were in charge of deciding what wars they were going to fight and how they were going to fight them. And so consequently, all of the sources about Jewish war ethics are either very old, more than 2,000 years old, or very new from the fighting for creating the state of Israel and ever since, right? So the last century, basically. So given that, there was I described the fact that I was invited to be part of a conference in 2010 called by Professor Asa Kasher. Professor Asa Kasher was professor of philosophy at Tel Aviv University. He may be retired by now. He was among those that created the code of ethics for the Israel Defense Forces right after the establishment of the state. It's called Ruach Tzahal. You can Google it actually if you want, Code of Ethics for IDF or Ruach Tzahal, and you can see what it is. And then he was also involved in the revision of that code later on, especially after the Six-Day War. You may know of a book called The Seventh Day. In Hebrew, it was a translation of the Hebrew book Siach Lochamim, literally a discussion among the fighters. And what that book was, it was a discussion among those Israeli soldiers who fought in the Six-Day War and talked about the fact that what had been the gold standard of Israeli war ethics up to that point had been very problematic. The gold standard was one that Ben Gurion had started during the War of Independence, namely Tohar Hanesha, purity of arms. The point being that you should only fight in order to defend yourself. That was purity of arms, and that was the norm That was the ethic, as it were, during Israel's War of Independence. But when they got to the Six-Day War, the Israeli soldiers found themselves in situations in which it wasn't very clearly that there was these people that were trying to kill you and you had to defend yourself. There was guerrilla warfare. There were people who were civilians who were all of a sudden not civilians and attacking Israeli civilians and soldiers. And so you get that discussion in that book. It was translated as The Seventh Day, and you got a revision of the Code of Ethics of the Israeli Defense Forces after that. And there's been, and now given the realities of whatever you think of them, of the developments of Jewish settlements on the West Bank and Gaza and all of that, given that there needed to be another revision. So he called together a conference in northern Israel in 2010, and two of the people that he asked to address that were Professor Michael Walzer, and yours truly. Professor Michael Walzer is a really smart, lovely guy, also a conservative Jew, by the way, who has been part of the faculty of the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies for decades, and wrote a book on war, actually, and facing the reality that I just described, namely that Jews have not been in a position to decide what wars they were going to fight and how they were going to fight them since the Maccabean period. And so consequently, but in the meantime, the Catholic tradition, and then later on the secular Enlightenment tradition, developed codes of ethics of war, rules of war. So his way of dealing with it was to say, well, then we should learn from what others have done and make that Jewish. And that is a perfectly legitimate move. Jews have learned from other cultures a lot. And so an awful lot of Jewish business law, for example, in the Talmud is a direct borrowing from the Romans. Similarly, Jewish family law is a direct borrowing from the Romans, much of it. And actually, some of my teachers back at the Jewish Theological Seminary, one of them was Professor Saul Lieberman, who wrote books on Hellenism and Jewish Palestine, Greek and Jewish Palestine, in which he talked about the effects of Greek culture on Jews during that period. And another professor there, Boaz Cohn, wrote a two-volume book on Roman and Jewish law. So, I mean, borrowing from the culture around us is not a false move. You just have to be very careful about what you borrow and how you express what you borrow, and in order to make it Jewish. So that's what Professor Walzer wanted to do. What I suggested instead was that we do what I call deep theology. That is, you go into the tradition, into the underlying conceptions of who we are as human beings and as members of a community in covenant with God, who we are and who we strive to be. And then based upon those kinds of that depth theology, that fundamental conceptions of who we are as human beings and who God is, that we come up with an ethic that is inherently Jewish. And then we can test it to see whether it is workable in modern warfare. So the ethic that I ultimately come up with is in the I described in this book. First of all, the jus ad bellum, justifications for going to war, and what I have here is 5 principles. War sometimes must be fought. The Jewish concept of both, I'm on page 163 for those who have the book. The Jewish concept of both God and people understand them as sometimes making war. 2, although conquest of territory justified war in the past, now only self-defense and avoidance of idolatry are acceptable reasons to go to war. Some wars will be clearly defensive in nature, but nowadays with the rise of terrorism, guerrilla warfare, and hidden nuclear bombs and other weapons of mass destruction, sometimes the claimed need to go to war for self-defense purposes is much harder to prove. 3, self-defense may include preemptive strikes when the bellicose intention of the enemy is clear. This was certainly the case when Egypt's Nasser blocked the Straits of Tiran, and publicly engaged in extensive saber rattling in the days before the Six-Day War. In 1967, it proved not to be the case in President George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003 to destroy the weapons of mass destruction that were supposed to be there but were not. 4, Jews as a nation should fight only in those wars that they are likely to win. This is a clear derivation of the demand to preserve our life and health as property of God. That's another part of how the Jewish tradition understands who we are as human beings. We are not individuals who own our own lives. We are the property of God, which we have on loan during our lifetime. And we have a fiduciary responsibility. That is, God trusts us to take care of our bodies. And part of that is you don't go to war that you know that you're going to lose. So you have to, and then number 5, war should be avoided if at all possible. Peace must be clearly and actively sought. This is articulated not only in the rabbinic sources that say this explicitly, but also in all the prayers and hopes of the Jewish tradition for a world without war. The Jewish culture accepts war when necessary to defend oneself and honors those who succeed in that task, but does not glorify war as the way to prove a man's masculinity and a nation's power. So that's in regard to jus ad bellum, justifications for going to war. And then jus in bello, proper conduct within war. Number 1, kill as few people as possible. Judaism's strong emphasis on protecting and saving life demands that even in defense of war, one must seek to kill as few people as possible. Even though Ben-Gurion was a secular Jew, this element of the Jewish religious tradition undoubtedly influenced him in formulating his doctrine of Tohar HaNeshek, purity of arms, according to which soldiers may shoot only those who have attacked them first. This was clearly not the norm in the conquest of Canaan, when the Israelites were commanded to kill all the inhabitants. But that series of wars occurred some 3,000 years ago, and most importantly, the rules governing those wars do not constitute precedents for any wars thereafter. Maimonides actually says that there are no longer any Canaanites, and therefore the laws of going to war and getting rid of all of the Canaanites no longer are applicable to any population today. That's Maimonides already 1,800 years ago. Number 2, preserve your own life and that of your own comrades in arms. One has primary responsibility to protect and defend one's own life and those of one's comrades in arms and in community. Therefore, even though one should seek to win while killing as few of the enemy as possible, one must kill as many as necessary to protect one's own life and those of one's army and community. 3, damage the environment as little as possible. Hence the remarkable requirement in Deuteronomy to preserve the fruit trees, a mandate that can easily be applied to modern environmental concerns in war, such as the use of napalm in the Vietnamese War. Number 4, war must not justify rape or other forms of torture, humiliation, or injury of the enemy, not required to defend oneself and one's community. This stems directly from the respect we must have for all human beings as creatures of God, created in the divine image. It leaves open the possibility, recognized by the Israeli Supreme Court, of some forms of physical pressure to reveal the whereabouts of terrorists about to kill many people, the ticking bomb case, but only if such procedures can be demonstrated to prevent such terrorism, and that's really questionable. The questionable about whether torture ever leads to reliable information is very, very questionable, and therefore even that justification for torturing prisoners of war is frankly questionable. And finally, 5, the norms with regard to booty and other forms of enemy property are unclear. This emerges from the conflicting norms found on the one hand in Joshua and Saul's stories, both of which see the taking of booty as unacceptable, and the law permitting the taking of booty in Deuteronomy and on the other hand. So let me stop here and take some questions. Natalie is going to please put them in the chat, and Natalie is going to organize that for us. And please understand that we probably will not get to all questions, but I will answer as many as I can. So Natalie, if you will, go ahead.
Yes, we have a question from Rhonda. What gives humans the right to decide who lives and who dies according to Jewish tradition?
Well, actually, the way that works is that in civil society, the ones who decide who lives and who dies are the court, and there's supposed to be a justice system that determines who lives and who dies. And and again, in civilian, when we're not at war, in civilian society, even there, even though the death penalty in the Torah is prescribed for 36 different offenses, not just for murder or rape or whatever, but for not observing Shabbat. For example, the death penalty is required for a whole series of sexual offenses. The death penalty is required in the Torah. I'm talking about for unjust business practices. The death penalty is required. So by the time you get to the rabbis, they don't like the death penalty, and I think for very good reason, namely that how do you know that the person really committed this crime? How good is your evidence? And if you execute the person, there's no going back from that. So the rabbis created evidentiary rules of evidence, that made it virtually impossible to have a capital conviction. So, for example, if somebody is has a knife in hand, is about to kill someone else, then according to rabbinic law, two witnesses have to warn that person, let's say a man, just for purposes of not having to say him or hers each time, have to warn him, do you realize that what you are about to do is not only against the law, but brings the death penalty? Now, it's possible, and each of them has to do it separately. And each of the two witnesses may not be related to the person or to each other. And they each individually have to give that warning. But of course, it's possible that the man didn't hear it. So the man has to reply to each of them, yes, in fact, I heard the warning and I understand what the law requires. I'm going to do it anyway. But people forget. So how much time may elapse from the time that the person says he's heard the warnings and he plunges the knife into the victim, the amount of time it takes to say, Shalom Alecha Rabbi Mori. If it takes any more time than that, then you assume that the perpetrator has forgotten the warning and the case is thrown out of court. Now, as my grandmother used to say, the Jewish tradition knew what to do with no goodniks, right? So, I mean, it's not that the fact that such people are exempted from the death penalty doesn't mean that they don't get any punishment whatsoever. But by the time you get to the Mishnah, around 200 of the Common Era, this is in Makot, chapter 1, Mishnah 10, the rabbis say that a court that decreed a death penalty once in 7 years is a bloody court. Others say once in 70 years. And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon say that if we were on the court, there would never be a capital conviction. So in civil society, we're not at war. It's the court that determines who lives and who dies. In classical Jewish tradition, in war, it has to do with first of all, who's attacking you. So if you are attacked, remember, Habala Harkaka Hashkem Largo, one who comes to kill you, kill him first. So defensive wars are by far the easiest to justify. That doesn't mean one should love to get into them. One should try to create a peaceful solution to whatever the issue is first. But if they're attacking you, then you decide, if you're the one being attacked, who's going to get killed. It gets much, much more difficult. Let me just say, if you are in the kind of situation that Israel is in today, where it's not just one line of soldiers against another line of soldiers, it's easily identified by their uniform. You're talking about civilians that are hiding weapons and combatants and all of that, and so it gets much, much more difficult to know when it is appropriate for, let's say, an Israeli soldier to enter a home in the West, an Arab home in the West Bank, gun raised, and maybe even shooting at people. I mean, that's the kind of really difficult situation that Israel is facing now, and so hence there are yet other revisions of the Code of Jewish Ethics that for the Israeli Defense Forces that are in the works, because the kind of neat distinctions that I was making there in what I just read to you, are important as a general rule, but they need to be honed a lot. in terms of the realities of modern warfare.
Thank you for a very lucid presentation, Dr. Dorff. My question is, how would you describe the relationship between personal religious experiences, individual conscience, or mystical encounters on the one hand, and a particular religious tradition as codified in scripture, rituals, or collective stories on the other? If the two conflict, which should take precedence and why? Kind of a long question, so let me know if you need me to repeat
So that's
any of
fine.
that.
That's absolutely
Okay,
fine.
great.
Well, let me just say it's both and, right? Because we as human, that is religious experiences, both individual and communal. Because we human beings are both individuals, and from the moment we're born, we're part of a family and a community and the like, right? We don't live on isolated islands, or let me just say, very few of us live on isolated island. And even if we do, we may be in contact these days with people elsewhere in the world. Um, I still am absolutely amazed that we can have this conversation with people who, as far as I know, are all over the country, maybe all over the world, and have Zoom conversations. I've had Zoom conversations with people in Israel and Europe and the like. Unbelievable. But in any case, as individuals, we might have all kinds of religious experience. Remember, religion means relating to. The lig again means forming a connection with. So there can be religious experiences with God or with your community that you're having. Let's say you get up in the morning and you're davening on your own. You nevertheless are davening with let's say you're davening with a siddur. So you're davening with a communal product, and you are thereby connecting with your tradition and your community, past, present, and God willing, future. Right? So you could have an individual, let's say, prayer experience, or you could have an individual, a very, very individual rational experience. It doesn't have to be mystical. You could, I have a doctorate in philosophy. I love this stuff. You could have a lot of arguments about what does it mean to believe in God and the proofs for the existence of God and whether that means anything or not. And you can have, certainly people like Rambam, Maimonides again, but certainly many others as well, Hermann Cohen and others would say that you could have an experience with God through your reasoning power. You might have an experience with God in a communal way. And Judaism is much more communitarian than American ideology. The American part of us is very individualistic. We are individuals with rights, right? In the Jewish tradition is very communitarian. We're members of a community with duties. So the way that the standard ways, let me say the central ways in which the Jewish tradition understands our religious experiences is as a community, as a minyan for davening, as a community in engaging in social action, as a community in Israel issues, as a community in interfaith things, right? It's not just Elliot Dorff involved in interfaith things. It's Elliot Dorff as a rabbi or somebody else as a lay leader who's involved in these things, representing the community to the extent that one can. So the Jewish tradition certainly values individual religious experiences, including mystical ones. I must say that I'm on the left brain side of these things rather than the right brain side more, although the right brain side of me was part of the reason why I got really interested in things Jewish was Camp Ramah, and just the joy of singing in Hebrew and dancing in Hebrew and playing sports in Hebrew and putting on plays in Hebrew and that kind of communal experience, which was very right brain experience, right? Emotional stuff was a lot of what drew me to be seriously Jewish. But the other part of what really drew me to be seriously Jewish, which I describe at the beginning of this book, is a series of conversations that Rabbi David McGillner, Aloha Shalom, who was the director of Camp Ramah, Wisconsin, where I was during my teenage years and later on, led a conversation when I was among the 15 and 16-year-olds when I was that age on Monday nights. For some reason, I remember that over the 8 weeks of camp. And he started out by saying, how many of you keep kosher at home and out? And a certain number of people raise their hands. How many of you don't keep kosher at all? And a certain number of people raise their hands. How many of you keep kosher at home but not out? And that's what my family did. And he said, it's you people I don't understand because you were inconsistent. And then he was on the attack. He was basically saying to us, why would anybody in his or her right mind do any of these Jewish things or believe any of these Jewish things? And he started out with very concrete things like Kashrut and Shabbat, and then went to more abstract things like revelation and prayer and God. And I don't remember any of the results of those discussions, but what was really important to me was that here was a man who was deeply committed to the tradition. He was a rabbi, after all, and he was not only willing but actually eager to ask all kinds of questions that would completely overturn the apple cart, as it were, completely undermine the tradition. And now I realize as an adult that that's a wonderful educational technique to use with teenagers, because it got us to defend the tradition rather than the other way around. But what he showed me was that you didn't have to turn off your mind to be seriously Jewish. And that for me was really important. Much later on, I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy and a doctorate in philosophy. And one of my graduate professors said that a philosopher is a 5-year-old child who never stopped asking why. That's who I am, right? And I was that even in my teenage years. So the fact that he showed me that you could literally, well, what the Shema says, you could love God with all your soul, with all your heart, and with all your might, and that included your intellect as well as your emotional life. That for me was really, really important. And it was after that summer that I started keeping kosher both at home and out. And by the way, in Milwaukee, I grew up in Milwaukee, had no kosher restaurants. Um, and so this came at a real cost. So first of all, it meant that I couldn't go to the Friday night basketball games, which was a real social no-no at the time. And on Saturday night during the winter, when Dorff would reappear, as it were, among my friends, and we went to a movie and then went out to eat. The new place in town was Big Boy. Big Boy is cheeseburgers, right? But I didn't get a cheeseburger. I got a fish sandwich or a salad or something like that. I must say my non-Jewish friends thought it was cool because I had principles. My Jewish friends thought it was medieval. Okay. Um, and it was, so I had to learn how to defend this. I had to learn how to explain this to myself, let alone to my friends. So the rational part of my religious experience has been really important to me, as well as the emotional part, much less the mystical part. And I must say that's just Elliot Dorff. I have immense respect for people who find the mystical part of one's experience as being focal, as being something that is really important. Um, it's just there are those and those, right? And certainly the Jewish tradition has developed the whole Kabbalistic tradition, and so it's very much part of our tradition. Um, but there are those who are that way and those who are the other way, rational versus mystical. And I would say, God, God, Godspeed to both sides. Okay, if one can find religious meaning in either way that the Jewish tradition has expressed himself, God bless you for doing so.
Great. We probably have time for just one more. Nancy asks, can Jewish ethical behavior be based upon conduct or thought not explicitly referenced in Torah or based on Talmudic interpretation?
Sure. As a matter of fact, Nachmanides, Ramban, came up with an expression recognizing that one could be what he calls a naval b'reshut haTorah, a scoundrel within the bounds of the Torah or with the permission of the Torah, depending upon how you translate reshut there, right? So in other words, what he, a rabbi who wrote a long commentary on the Torah and all kinds of other things, this is in his commentary to Leviticus 19:2. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And his point is that one could observe every jot and tittle of the law, to borrow a phrase from the New Testament. One could observe every piece of it and yet be a scoundrel. And the point that he's after is that the law itself cannot possibly articulate the entirety of what's required of us in order to be a Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, and Exodus 19:6, right? A holy nation, and Mamlechet Kohanim, a nation of priests and a holy nation. In order to, Judaism is very aspirational that way, right? It tries as much as any tradition tries to define what it means to be holy, what it means to be godlike in legal terms. I think more than, with the possible exception of Islam, I think more than any other tradition that I know of, including East Asia as well as Western the Western traditions or the Abrahamic traditions, um, Judaism tries as much as possible to articulate what is required of us in legal terms, and that's really important because law is a much better tool for doing that than simply moral principles. I mean, you should be honest. That's wonderful. But what does it mean to be honest in very concrete circumstances? Is it honest to photocopy a copyrighted book, let's say? Well, under what circumstances and all of that, right? Hence, you get, by the way, American copyright law, trying to distinguish what is in the public domain and what is copyrighted and not in the public domain. Well, Judaism has similar kinds of things. And I think the Jewish law is often very instructive. I mean, one example of that is that the Mishnah says in Bava Metzia, you may not go into a store and ask what the price of something is if you don't have an intention to buy it, or you don't know a friend who does have an intention to buy it. But let's say you just bought it, and now you see it being offered in another store, and you want to find out if you got a Metzia, you got a bargain. That you may not do because that is oppressing the storekeeper, right? Because you're stealing that person, not only that person's time from that person, you're also stealing that person's mind, which is what it's called Gneva Da'at, because you're making that person think that he or she might have a sale here. And what you're doing is just finding out the price. So the Mishnah already says that it is ona'at avarim, it is oppression done by means of words, which we'll get to in another session, if you do that. So I think the law is really precious in terms of helping us define what is moral and what is not. That said, the law by itself is not sufficient, and the rabbis themselves say that in the Talmud. The rabbis say one of the two reasons why, there are two reasons why the Second Temple was destroyed. One was that sinat chinam, baseless hatred, and the other was that the Jews of the time were only doing what the law required, and that was what was lifnim mishurat hadin, beyond the letter of the law. So yes, the law, it gives you a kind of base, and it gives you a really, I think, thought out base and a really important base. I value it a lot as a legal, as a moral tool as well as a legal base. But it's not. But the Talmud itself and later Nachmanides would say it's the base and not the entirety of what is required of us as being a nation that is intended to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Okay. So as I say next time in the description, next time we're going to be talking about aid in dying and talking about how we apply ancient and medieval traditions to modern issues. If you can, read chapters 4 to 7 in the book in preparation for next week. If you can't, don't worry about it. I'll try to make I'll teach as if you have not done it. But if you have done it, I think the experience will be just richer. Okay, and maybe even clearer. Okay, have a good week. I look forward to seeing you next week.